Okay, so here is the rotary fountain. This was designed by Harold Blaze and Bob Perrin, I think. I can't remember that name for sure, it's on the paper. One of the things that becomes kind of interesting is the fact that you've got these 4 columns. They aren't quite straight. So why does the artist make the choice to have them be a little bit more organic? It's an interesting choice. He could have made it easier, it could have looked cleaner, but he purposely gives it an imperfect look. Also, there's an interesting texture that's on the steel, and that is something that you might want to think about as you're looking at this particular sculpture. One of the things that becomes important is the idea of negative space. We talked early on in the semester about negative space in an artwork where there isn't something going on. Here, you've got a lot of empty space. Sort of makes sense being a fountain. It's not complete without water running through it, but it's also, in this case, not complete without people running through it. So Blaze left a lot of room for people to be running around and using the empty space of this sculpture. So there's a lot of negative space. Another thing that's interesting is the use of line. If we look at, not only are the 4 columns kind of a bold line, but we've got a line of metal on the top, and then there are those curved lines that are at the top of each one of the columns. That sort of calligraphic line. And that calligraphic curved line is something you'll find in a fair amount of Harold Blaze's work. So that can be something you might want to talk about in terms of, when we look about elements, we can talk about scale, we can talk about volume, we can talk about line, shape. So there are a lot of things that we can talk about. These benches are new. So those weren't part of the original design. Those were just added in the last year or so. And this is about, I can't remember, 2005 is when it was dedicated. So it's been around a while now. We're going to take some closer looks at some things so you can kind of get a better sense of texture. One of the things to look for is the use of river rock at the base of the columns, because this is right near the river. And the river rock kind of helps connect it to the location of being next to the river. So we'll take a look over here closer. So as we look here, the river is right over here, just past the sidewalk over there. You can see the river there. This is the Louvre Carousel, so you get some idea of where it's located in Riverfront Park. This gives you some idea, a little closer look at some of those lines. Gives you some idea of some of the size. These are lights. Again, we've got this rock, and this is sort of writing that Harold Blaze tended to use. Obviously, this is a sponsor here, but he's even done it in his own sort of writing. This gives you a better idea of some of the texture. More sponsors. But he's done some interesting texturing with some tools. And then there is some of the river rock there at the column. And this is kind of interesting. We have the city of Spokane on one side, and then when we cross that street, we're in Riverfront Park. And we are going to start walking towards the garbage-eating goat. on. And this is the garbage eating goat. All right, you see here the Garbage Eating Goat by Sister Paula Turnbull. This is a welded sculpture, and it was done in 1974. Riverfront Park was created in 1974 for the World's Fair, and the theme was ecology. That was our name at the time for, trying to conserve resources, trying to be responsible with the planet, and it became really important in the 1970s. It wasn't something that we talked about as much before then. So the idea that was a concern in the 1970s is important context for this particular sculpture. And another thing that makes it interesting for context is that it's surrounded by basalt rock. Basalt rock is native to the Spokane area. We're part of the basalt river flow, the basalt rock flows from the Columbia River basalt flows that have to do with volcanic activity all those millennia ago. And so this is prevalent rock here, and so it helps to identify this as something that belongs to this region. But we're going to take a look at the sculpture close up and talk about some of the choices and why they start to relate to that theme of ecology. Okay, one of the things you may notice here is that this is just made up of all kinds of scraps. So instead of throwing scraps away, it becomes useful as a piece of art. So we've got these springs, we've got rebar in here. Something that's kind of interesting, we've got the rebar down there. Notice that the welds are not finished. The welds are left really rough. Why would you think that the sculptor would actually make that choice? The sculptor could have made these welds look clean and nice, but instead she left it looking really rough. Think about the character of the goat. The goat is always portrayed as kind of a rough, temperamental kind of animal. And so the roughness of the metal, the roughness of the welds kind of fits in and adds to the personality of the goat. But it also, as we talked about, I don't know if we talked about patina with the rotary fountain, but this brings up an important point with that. When you have a metal sculpture, the metal sculpture has a texture, right? And this, of course, is kind of a rough texture, but you can feel the metal, and it's just been allowed to rust. It hasn't been chemically treated. A lot of times a metal sculpture will be treated so it doesn't age or get aged by the weather. And this is designed to get aged by the weather. So this patina is a natural patina that's occurred over time. They oftentimes will put a chemical patina on a metal sculpture that'll give it a particular look and preserve the metal and the way it starts to look and interact with the weather. Oftentimes it'll start becoming a green sort of color. Something else that makes it this a little bit fun. I've got to try to find a leaf. Just a moment. Okay, so this goat actually does kind of a nice trick because it's about waste. We're not only using recycled kinds of metals and stuff, but if you press this button, you can take a piece of trash. The goat eats the trash. So now we're going to make our way to the Childhood Express, usually called the Big Red Wagon. So we're going to go around this curve and get a glimpse of the river. So this gives you some idea. If you can imagine what would Spokane be like without this green space here in this downtown area as we go by the river. This gives Spokane, it certainly has a lot to do with creating something of a personality and something of a respite from the concrete and the buildings. So we're going to approach the Childhood Express. what you're seeing here is the Childhood Express, sculpted by Ken Spearing, oftentimes called the Big Red Wagon for obvious reasons. He actually got permission from the Radio Flyer company to use their logo. This is mostly concrete, but one of the things you might think about this sculpture is the idea of scale, right? In fact, if that gives it anything of its personality, something you might think about for unifying principle could be scale, because that is kind of the most remarkable thing. It's kind of probably influenced by an artist named Klaus Oldenburg, who would take household items or small items and make really large sculptures of them. But this has a fair amount of negative space underneath, although we don't tend to think of it as negative space because it's such a realistic thing. This is a very representational sculpture. It took Ken 2 years to do this. They gave him a $30,000 stipend. So when you figure you're working for 2 years for $30,000, that means $15,000 a year. They are actually not paying that much for that sculpture because that included his labor and his materials, and ultimately he spent the money on labor and materials. Mostly his own labor. He worked 6.5 days every week until 1 week where he got sick and he missed a day. But two solid years of working, which also meant he couldn't do other things. We'll take a closer look at some of the aspects of this, but they've got it roped off so we can't actually go slide down. Normally that would be the thing to do, but we'll take a closer look here. So you see the detail that has been put into the creation of this. These hubs were actually, Ken said, one of the hardest things for him to accomplish. The hubs on the wheels. And then one day they were having lunch and they were having salads, and it occurred to them that the salad bowl that they were being served from would be perfect for the wheels on the tires. So they asked the restaurant for 4 salad bowls and got them. Now they have to do some maintenance on this, but you can climb up the back here, go inside. And you could walk around up at the top there. There's a lot of graffiti up there usually. And then slide down. So you can see a connection between its name being the Childhood Express and the fact that it's a big red wagon. But we're going to look across the river here. The sculpture you're seeing now is the Centennial sculpture, and it was, if you're wondering, if you're trying to guess who it might have been, if you think about the rotary fountain and the way the steel looks and the calligraphic line, you're probably seeing some similarities to the rotary fountain, and it's not an accident. Harold Blaze was the artist that designed both of those. You'll see the same texturing on the steel, and there's a lot of use of interesting negative space here. So we get, what's kind of interesting about this particularly is that not only is it in the water, but as you might have noticed, it's directly across from the Childhood Express, which is right over here. So you've got a representational sculpture that looks very much like that red wagon. And then you've got this much more abstract work here with the Centennial sculpture. And it was done for, obviously, Spokane's 100th birthday. It is in the river, which is something that is very much a part of Spokane's identity. And if you look, it's almost got something, if you look towards the right side there, you see something that almost looks like a rudder. and then there's sort of waves and kind of a suggestion of a boat. It's not representational, but you see this sort of abstract feel. What's kind of interesting is as the current changes, this is pivoted at the bottom of the riverbed, and actually the sculpture will turn as the current changes. So that becomes an interesting aspect of this. I'm going to take the camera off the tripod here and kind of zoom in to get you to look at it a little bit more closely, to see some of the texture, look at the negative space, look at the flow of the line, how that calligraphic line looks, and try to kind of look at, again, back from this to the big red wagon, where you get an idea of these two sculptures kind of talking to each other, having a bit of a conversation between the representational and the abstract. And something else that I find interesting is if you look at the way the sunlight hits on the overpass there, you see the reflection of the sunlight, and then you look at the texturing on the Centennial sculpture, and it creates a bit of a conversation there as well. So it's really kind of an interesting choice that Harold Blaze makes here. And just again to give you some idea of that conversation, there is the big red wagon. So we have the representational and the abstract. All right, we are going to go and start looking at Harold Blaze's concrete sculpture called Untitled. So we're going to have to go under this overpass and go around this curve here. And as we come out of the overpass, you start to see this rather large concrete sculpture. Notice it's right next to the Performing Arts Center. It was designed to come here and be built. We've got more basalt rock and river rock and volcanic rock surrounding this. Okay, so this is Harold Blaze's sculpture. As I said, it's untitled. People call it Chinese lantern because if you look at Japanese Chinese lanterns, they tend to be made of paper with a lot of things cut out. And the negative space used in this sculpture, even though it's made out of concrete, that negative space tends to make it feel lighter, sort of like a Chinese lantern. So that is what it's become, what has become its nickname, even though Blaze didn't title it. But you see a lot of that calligraphic line. You see that it's abstract. Scale becomes an important issue. That negative space becomes an important issue. The use of line becomes an important issue. And if you look closely, you can see these different pieces are actually like puzzle pieces. These are smaller pieces that were assembled here, and they just fit together like puzzle pieces. Harold Blaze actually pioneered a way to work with concrete to create sculptures like this that other people have used since he perfected it. So we're going to take a look over here in just a minute, but before we do that, let's take a look down at the river. Well, first off, you can see the Riverfront Park clock tower. Now that used to be the clock tower for the train station, and the two of these sculptures kind of have a conversation, or the clock tower is architecture. Those two pieces almost have a conversation together, where you've got the, just a real clock tower and then this abstract piece of art. But if we look down at the river, you may notice there's a Centennial sculpture there. And park equipment. So not only does the clock tower and the untitled tower have a conversation, but Blaze's own work with the Centennial sculpture and its own calligraphic line and textures start to have a conversation together. So this becomes kind of an interesting point of looking at these sculptures. So you can walk around this. You could actually climb inside that area if you so desired. You can see how these pieces kind of fit together, where there are joints that hold it together. There's cable inside that kind of keeps it tight. So we get the rough rock here, and then the much more smooth concrete. You get an idea of how thick it is. And this placement was designed, again, it was designed to be placed right next to the Performing Arts Center. Here we get a better view of the Centennial sculpture from this vantage point, and of the clock tower. This is something else about sculptures. They're three-dimensional, so just looking at them from one point of view isn't necessarily going to show you everything you need to know about the piece. And now we're going to go on to Keep the Dream Alive. And Keep the Dream Alive is just down the sidewalk. You can see it, we're approaching it just past this stairway. So this was dedicated to Michael Anderson, who was on the Challenger when it tried to re-enter the atmosphere and caught fire and was destroyed. The sculptor is by Dorothy Fowler. Is Dorothy Fowler. Here, obviously, we have a representational piece honoring Michael Anderson. It's quite realistic. You can see seams. His spacesuit looks pretty accurate. There's texture in his hair. This has been treated with, this is bronze, probably done with that lost wax process that you might, if you look at the video that's under the field trip assignment that you could take a look at just to see what that process looks like. That's quite likely what was done here. This has been treated to keep looking the way it does. It's kind of in need of a little cleanup, but it's always going to have this brownish, bronzish more tint here. Seeing this from different angles is really helpful too. You notice though that again, I'll let you see close up the texture of the bird, the texture of the shoes, and there's actually a design in the base as well. But notice that he is sculpted a little larger than life. And why does the sculptor make that choice? What is she trying to say? You know, is this somebody who's a hero? Is that something that she's trying to get at by making him just a little larger than life? Because as a human being, we see him as a little larger than life. So I'm going to let you take some closer looks here. All right. So you see the texture on the bird feathers. You see the detail. You can see the expression on his face. He looks like a real person. Obviously, because he was. You see some of the details of the flight suit. So you might want to talk about texture. You might want to talk about scale. You might want to talk about the representational nature, right? We get the title, Keep the Dream Alive, is on the base. We even get texture on the soles of the shoes, by the way. That's kind of interesting. And then we get that insignia too. But something that becomes really interesting about this is, you know, we're looking at it from the side of the river with this backdrop. But with sculptures, as I mentioned, you can go 3D around them. And what starts to happen with this, does it change your impression of the sculpture? As we now see him releasing the bird into the sky and have the park as the background. This is why sometimes it can be useful to walk all the way around a sculpture and take it in. And this is also an interesting point as we go back around here. If you look through this piece of architecture, this is something that architecture can do. The Grand Hotel has sort of ruined this as a nexus point, but we see the convention center, we see the performing arts center, we see this passageway through, and if you look there at the performing arts center, you see this mirrored, the glass creates a mirror where you can see the Riverfront Park, and then you can actually see, you used to be able to see through here into downtown. So you could see the old downtown and then the new Riverfront Park all in one place because of the reflective surface. That now another piece of architecture has sort of destroyed what that used to do. But you still see the Inland North, or the Performing Arts Center reflected in the windows of the Grand Davenport. So you can see, again, Riverfront Park, and then there's still Riverfront Park. So a very interesting point that's created by architecture, and then of course now it doesn't do what it used to because of another piece of architecture. We're going to move on now to Ken Spearing's The Call and the Challenge. So again, we're next to the river here. And we're just going to follow this walk. And we're going to go just past that bridge there, because that's where the Call and the Challenge is located. There's the bridge. And this brick and concrete structure that we're approaching is the Call and the Challenge. So this is Ken Spearing's The Call and the Challenge. It's a tribute to the sisters who built the Sacred Heart Hospital, because its first site was across the river here. And so we've got a nun, you can't see it very well because of the light, but we'll get a closer up look for you, who is putting mortar and bricks together here. So this is a structure that's under construction. And this was a collaboration between Ken Spearing and Harold Blaze, mostly Ken Spearing, but you notice, again, the use of negative space. The actual spatial aspect of this is really interesting. We've got a sculpture here, we've got the bricks, and then there's a lot of space, and there's a workman. If you look way in the distance, you can see the figure of a person who's pushing a wheelbarrow, and we'll take a closer look at that too. So this actually takes place in a space, in a way that some sculptures don't. It's almost like an installation piece. So it's quite interesting that way. So we're going to take a quick look at the nun and some of the texturing there and get an idea of what this space starts to look like. But you get this interesting combination here of realism, the representational nun, the representational workman, and then the somewhat abstract structure and use of space. So here's the nun, and you see the brick and the mortar tool, which, by the way, was stolen for a while when it was first done, so he had to keep replacing it for a while. It almost nearly killed him at one point. He was in the shop working still working on the texturing, and the figure started to fall over while that sharp thing was in the hand and fell towards him. So as you look here, you can see the texture. It's pretty rough, and he's done that on purpose. It's unfortunate we can't see his wooden carving that's in the City Hall building, because you'll see that the scalloped sort of rough texture is one that he used in that wood carving as well, that wooden sculpture, which was the first wood sculpture that he did. But this is a bronze, again, that lost wax process. So she's working here. We have this structure, and then we can walk over to the workman here. Who is bringing more bricks. And this, by the way, the model for this figure was Harold Blaze, who was a friend of Ken Spearing's and again, collaborator on this piece. This is when he was younger. If I had a mirror and more light, we could probably see the inscription underneath the heel had Harold Blaze's motto on it that says "Transcend the bullshit." So, but again, we've got this same texture here. So this is one where you can really look at it from different angles and get more out of it, and you can just sit, interact with it, sit and contemplate the river, walk through the space, and then of course there is information about its history. So it takes up a fair amount of space. And that is Ken Spearing's The Call and the Challenge. We're now going to cross the bridge, and we're going to head over to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Sculpture. So we're going to be getting close to the tower, but not quite all the way over to it. When we get to the end of the bridge, you could follow the walkway around. It's a little hard to find. It's actually easier to just walk across the grass and walk up the hill. So that's what we're going to do. You see the tower there. When you look towards these trees, that is where we're heading. So this is Deborah Copenhaver's memorial statue to the Vietnam War veterans. It's kind of an interesting sculpture. Normally when we have a war memorial, you're used to seeing a soldier with, carrying armament and in battle positions. But here, he's actually holding a letter. You probably can't see that with the light, but I'll get the camera close in so you can get more of the details. He's sitting in a contemplative sort of way. You'll notice the patina, though, is something that's done commonly with bronze, is it's been chemically treated to become a bit more green, which kind of works for that olive drab uniform. So we've got the realism there. Notice he's sitting on a piece of basalt rock. Once again, it's natural to the region, so it places him in this inland northwest area. But the base is five-sided. It's in a pentagon shape. So it also connects him to the Pentagon, to Washington, and the rock that makes up the base is black granite, which is the same rock that's on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. So we have something that connects him locally and something that connects him to the larger community with the country in Washington, D.C. Just by the way, the sculptor designed this particular sculpture. So we're going to walk around. We'll give you a little chance to get a better view of the texture and the expression on the face. And it's also really important that as he's sitting here, you'll see where he's looking out onto, which is his hometown. So he's off in Vietnam, reading a letter from home, and his eyes and his mind, though, are seeing home as he reads the letter. So it's really quite an interesting sculpture, just in and of itself. But as a war memorial sculpture, it becomes quite interesting there. And you'll see that names are inscribed of the men and women who were lost in that battle from Spokane. So you can see he's holding the letter, get a better idea of the expression on his face. You can actually see pupils. I don't know if you can see it on the video, but they're there. You can see the names inscribed in this reflective black granite. Again, you see the basalt, the five-sided structure, and we see his view. Of course, most of that wasn't there when this was sculpted. But this was designed to go right in this spot. There was actually another piece of artwork that was moved so that this could be right in this spot. And there are benches. It's a nice contemplative place where people can find some space, unless some idiot humanities teacher is making a video for his students disturbing the piece. You can see, just like the Michael Anderson sculpture, there's a lot of detail, a lot of realism, and yet it's quite an unusual piece. In some ways it speaks to a sacrifice beyond risking one's life. So you could talk about a number of things here. You can talk about the representational quality, you can talk about the texture, you can talk about the color, you can talk about how the expression works, the interaction between the seated figure on the basalt rock and the black granite, the pentagon-shaped black granite connecting it to Washington, D.C. And its context, the trees here in the park. It's rather a pastoral setting. And there we can see him with Spokane's iconic clock tower. We'll take a quick look at the clock tower before we move along. Okay, looking back, that's where the Vietnam Veterans sculpture is. We just walk a few feet here to the edge of this overpass, and we get a great view of the clock tower. And you see the pyramid on top. Remember, people were fascinated in the early 20th century with pyramids, late 1800s. So we've got a Spanish-style kind of roof almost in a pyramid. We've got Corinthian columns. We've got Roman arches. So we've got Egyptian dentils, or not Egyptian. We've got Grecian dentils. There are all kinds of very interesting things going on with this piece of architecture. And from this vantage point, you get to see all of downtown. Maybe not all of it, but quite a bit of it. Kind of an interesting Art Deco building here. I can't remember what building that is. The owner at the very top had an apartment up there that he lived in for a long time. And there's a Chicago-style building. Can't see the Davenport from here, I don't believe. But a pretty interesting place. Now we're down below the hill of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There's the Performing Arts Center. If we look really close, you might be able to see the untitled lantern sculpture. There, of course, is the clock tower. The Centennial sculpture is down there, which means you can't see Childhood Express, but it's there. And there's the Louvre Carousel and the Rotary Fountain where we started off. So this path goes in kind of a nice little circle. And then, of course, that iconic Tower of Spokane that they've redone for the park. So we're going to walk over and I'm going to talk a little bit about the City Hall building, and then we'll be finished off with this section. This is City Hall. It used to be the Montgomery Ward's building, but you can see the Art Deco stuff. There's a lot of color on here. We'll pan so you can get a little closer view. It is kind of an interesting building. You see the Egyptian and Aztec influences, perhaps. You see it in the shape of the windows. You see some of the style of the art, certainly some of the color. So we can take a look at that real quickly before we move away from Riverfront Park. So the top of the building is kind of interesting. As we get down to these floors here, you see all sorts of decoration and color. It's very much a part of that Art Deco aesthetic. Even the lettering is the Art Deco type lettering from the 1920s. It became quite popular, you might remember. So there's a lot of decoration. There's a lot of interesting things going on with this building. And it does tend to want to take your sky up with all of these, your eyes up with all these vertical lines. Even though it's not the tallest of buildings, it becomes kind of an interesting building, kind of a fun one to have for a city hall. This is the Wheatland Bank building. But what's kind of interesting is built into the brick, they've actually put some artwork. And I imagine you can guess by now which artist this was by. Harold Blaze. So built right into the brick with its own special bricks. So that's kind of interesting to have something on just, a regular sort of building, but to put in some artwork and make it a little more interesting. All right, so now we really are done with Riverfront Park. Right, so now we're in Browne's edition, and this is right by the Museum of Arts and Culture here on 1st Street. The home you see behind me is the Campbell House. This was one of several homes built in the Browne's edition that came from the Silver Valley in Idaho from the mines, and the owners of the mines invested in Washington State, of course. But these three homes we're going to look at were all designed by Kirtland Cutter, and you'll notice that they are all different in their styles. So we're also going to look at a fourth one, the Patsy Clark House, because it's got a lot of interesting things going on. But the Campbell House is probably one of the best known homes, and you can actually tour it many days. You can go to the Museum of Arts and Culture, get a ticket to that, and then for a few dollars more on the weekends you can get a tour of the Campbell House, which is pretty impressive on the inside too. But you see a lot of Bavarian influence. Remember, we heard about Kirtland Cutter's European education and the influences of European architecture. So we get a lot of Bavarian influence. but these timbers in here also speak to a little bit of Tudor England, Elizabethan era England, and then there are the Gothic arches on the front door porch there. So there's a little Gothic influence. There is Victorian. There is the European, Bavarian. If we look over here, you'll notice that even the garage, the carriage house, has the same architectural style as the actual home itself. And now as we look down the street, this house next door was also a Kirtland Cutter home, and this mansion in a colonial style was a Kirtland Cutter design. So we're going to take a look at those. This is the Wakefield house. You notice the Spanish style roof. There's a little bit of Moorish influence on this front gable there. So there's a little Moorish, a little Spanish, which is actually pretty closely combined because the Moors occupied Spain for a long, long time. So you can look at the different color, the organic materials. Here, it's a much different kind of set of materials than was used in the Campbell house, where we have brick, but then we've got a lot of wood structure there. Here, there's a little less wood structure and a lot more plaster and adobe kind of feel. I'm not going to get too close here, and I don't want to get straight in front because just in case people might be home. But look at all the little aspects. There's a little bit of Victorian stick house with the kind of rambling roof line that you see going on here. So you can always talk about scale, but what's kind of most interesting are the stylistic differences that you see here, even though they were all designed by the same architect. And once again, even the carriage house matches the architectural style of the home. And right next door is the Finch Mansion, which is in the colonial style. You see the big columns. These are Ionic columns there on the front porch. You see all the different decorations that remind you of early United States in New England. This is a wooden structure. The scale of this one is pretty significant, so that's something that's kind of interesting. Pretty symmetrical overall, except for that addition that's been built on, or maybe that was actually part of it, I think, already. Interesting balconies there. Again, we've got the Spanish style and the Clark Mansion. So if you look at all three of these, one of the things that's kind of interesting to think about is how unique they all are from one architect. There's actually quite a bit of variety here. So you could write about these if you're so inclined. The Finch Mansion, Wakefield House, and the Campbell House, all designed by Kirtland Cutter. So we're going to leave this section of Browne's Addition, and we're going to go up a block and over a couple to look at the Patsy Clark Mansion. And this is the Patsy Clark Mansion, another person who became rich with the Idaho silver mines and built a sumptuous home over here in Spokane in Browne's Addition. You see a lot of things going on with this. You see predominantly that Roman arch right at the front of the building that greets you. There are very small columns on either side of that arch, little sort of compressed Corinthians. We see a few Roman arches over the windows, kind of keeping that motif up on the first floor. But on the second floor, we see a more Moorish kind of arch that's going on there. And there is some interesting fluting in the columns on the second floor, those sort of beige, ivory colored columns. There's a curved fluting to them. They don't go all the way through. We have a Spanish style roof, although some of the line is more Moorish. So we've got these turrets and columns that look a little more Moorish. So we've got some Roman influence, some Greek classical, some Corinthian columns with interesting fluting. So it's got this very interesting combination of architectural styles. Some people really liked it when it came out. Some people really hate it because there is so much going on that they say it's just a confusing piece of architecture. But it's a pretty fascinating piece, and if we get a chance, I think I might try to get closer because they're probably closed. It's a law office now, so we can get some views in here. The glass in the turrets is actually curved, so they've really did some interesting and expensive things. So I'm going to let us take a look at some of the detail here at the Clark Mansion. You can see the Roman arch, you can see the very short columns. We're going to go up the steps and look at one of the rooms. This at one time was a restaurant, so you could actually come in and eat and see the architecture inside. Now that it's a law office, it's a little harder to do. But look inside the turret there, that's kind of fun. Some interesting detail that's inside the home. Here we've got a look inside at what's become their conference room. You see a reflection of the windows. There's a mirror there above the fireplace. But on the ceiling, there's actually this painted ceiling. Pretty fun. The glass is double pane, so you get this interesting reflection. Gold leaf, Corinthian columns on the inside there. I wonder if we can see inside a little better. No. You'll notice even the brickwork here is uneven. And it's these little details that make a building really interesting sometimes. And this one is really fascinating. There's a lot of little details. Again, we have this compressed set of columns here with a Roman arch. This back porch. And what's become their parking lot. It's kind of interesting. We've got gargoyles here that do indeed function as rain gutters. In fact, this one just dripped a minute ago, so it based it. Yep, there we go. So there is a lot going on with this structure. It's a really fascinating building. So, as we say goodbye to the Clark Mansion, this is the end of what I'm covering here for the field trip. If I get a chance to come back and try to do a little more, I will, but I'm suspecting that won't happen, but at least you should have enough now to be able to write some papers. One of the interesting things about this building, it was set to be demolished in about 2000. A lot of the interior was ready to be trashed. Somebody came in and tried to save it. They saw so many priceless pieces of furniture and artifacts on the inside. So it ended up being saved. So that's been a pretty great thing. So it's a pretty fascinating structure. But this is going to end our tour for today. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to come back. So we'll say goodbye to Browne's Edition. And I'll be heading back home with my friend. Oh, I think maybe I stayed out a little long doing the filming here, longer than they expected. Oops.